Welcome, everybody. I'm Simon Parishsky, the Program Director of Eshkalot Project. And today we continue our series of talks, a mini series of 4 talks by Professor Mark Kaplan of Dartmouth College, devoted to the Yiddish national epic of Belarus, Rysan by Moshe Kulbak. And without any formal introductions, which I did last time, I want to pass the baton to Mark. I only want to emphasize that if you missed the first session, it is recorded and available for review, and all the materials and recordings of this series will be available, so you won't miss anything. And please write your questions and remarks in the chat, and Mark will respond to everybody at the end of the session. Mark, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Simon. Thank you very much, everybody who's here. We've got, by academic standards, by Zoom standards, pretty big crowd, and that's very, very gratifying. If I'm not mistaken, we're also broadcasting on Facebook, which means that it's not just it's not just us chickens that are here, but we are transmitting to the entire world. I'm speaking to you right now from Baton Rouge, Louisiana. It's morning here for a few more minutes. I imagine for many of you it is already evening. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Here in the United States, it's the day before Thanksgiving, so we're all getting ready for that. And here in Baton Rouge, it is like 28 degrees, 25 degrees outside. It's not really, it is not as cool here as it is in Moscow right now, but we're in the middle of a pretty ferocious thunderstorm. So we are all, the point that I'm trying to make, we are all bound by our limitations as set forth in the natural world. And that is very much a theme that we're going to be discussing today with reference to our poem. We don't really think of classic Yiddish literature and its relationship to nature so much. We think about classic Yiddish literature, its relationship to other Jewish people, occasionally, surprisingly less often than one might imagine, with reference to non-Jewish people, certainly the relationship of Jews to their semi-urban setting in the shtetl. But we don't think about Jews in nature when we read 19th century Yiddish or Hebrew literature. Well, this is the great poem. Rysan by Moshe Kulbak is the great poem of Jews in nature. And that's one of the themes that I want to be discussing today. Let me tell you a little bit about what I have in mind. First and foremost, it's a great honor to be here. It's a great honor to be invited to give a lecture whenever you have the opportunity. But it's particularly great to be invited back to give a lecture. That is the most gratifying experience that people in my line of work ever experience. And for those of you who were here last time, it's the ultimate, the superlative honor for people to return to a lecture that you've already begun giving at an earlier date. Those of you who happen not to have been here last time, as Simon says, they are the previous lecture and all of these lectures are going to be available online. If I'm not mistaken, they're online at the Eshkolot website. They're possibly available, at least for a limited time, through Facebook. They might also be posted at some point on YouTube. I'm not sure about that. But if you haven't heard last time's lecture, where we talked a lot about 19th century Yiddish literature, the poetic and formal traditions out of which Kulbak develops, and the specific background of this poem, that's available. Don't feel like you're caught inexorably behind, because you can catch up if you make time to listen to that lecture. And going forward, we're going to build on what we've discussed last time. I have in mind today to try to get through about the first third of the poem. We have 2 more lectures left, and I think and I hope that that will give everybody the opportunity to read the poem in its entirety and really to think, to digest the poem, so to speak, to marinate on it, to allow the poem to grow in your imagination, because it's actually, in my opinion, a very subtle poem. And because of its subtlety, it is all the more powerful for that reason. It really, really rewards the kind of slow reading that is our assignment for these 4 lectures, and further contemplation beyond the scope of my remarks, our sessions together, a single reading. So I hope that you will continue to think about this poem over the next few sessions. And I also hope that as we continue in our discussions from last week to this week to the next 2 weeks, that more and more of our time will be devoted to discussing it, and less will be devoted to me pretending to explicate it. Let me talk a little bit more generally before we turn to the specifics of the poem. And we only got through the first 1 or 2 sections last time, so we'll review that because we didn't get very far, but we'll go further today than we did last week. I talked last week about the aesthetic origins of the kind of poem that Kulbak is writing here. And I mentioned particularly that if we're to describe the poetic genre that it fits into, we would call it, and this is a very, very accidental, very, very serendipitous rhyme, but it's a very vivid rhyme. We would call it the ironic ballad, or we would call it the Byronic ballad. Let me do a little screen sharing here, just so that everybody gets this. You can see my screen, I hope. If you can't, let me know. Now, what I mean by this, when I say Byronic ballad, I'm referring to Lord Byron, the great British poet, who was a huge influence on 19th century, or what we would call Romantic verse, and was a particular favorite of Kulbak, as we can glean from the fact that one of Lord Byron's longest and most significant mock epics is called Childe Harold. Kulbak in 1929, about 7 years after he wrote the poem we're discussing today, wrote a poem called the Diesner Childe Harold, the Childe Harold of Diesner, that is much shorter than Lord Byron's ballad, which is enormous. It's just overwhelmingly large and complicated and wonderful. Kulbak wrote a miniature called the Diesner Childe Harold, which is the only literary venue, the only artistic representation he makes of his time in Berlin, which is the time when he wrote our poem, Reisen. When he writes the Diesner Childe Harold, very ironic ballad in its original, even more corrosively ironic in his adaptation of it to Yiddish, he was living in the Soviet Union, he was living in Minsk, and he was at pains to distance himself from his experiences in Berlin. The idea is, what was I doing in Berlin? I should have been building a socialist republic here in Minsk, but I was off in Berlin. And the poem reads as a kind of tshuva, a kind of act of confession and repentance from a loyal citizen of the state for his deviation in a previous era. As I've said before, Kulbak was a very uneasy, unlikely, and unfortunate fit for the Soviet Union. And we'll talk a little bit about this, I think, in the last session of our series 2 weeks from now. What happens to Kulbak in the Soviet Union, and why was this maybe not such a good idea from the beginning? But what's remarkable about the Diesner Childe Harold, Kulbak's direct adaptation of the Byronic form is the idea that at one and the same time, he is offering repentance for his time in Berlin. At the other, he is also offering the quintessential poetic performance of what it was like to be living in Berlin. It is an ironic confession. It is simultaneously mocking the time that he spent in Berlin and the notion that that time that he spent in Berlin was something to feel ashamed about. It is a very difficult and delicate and subtle performance, conceived in very broad, very ideologically acrobatic terms. And whatever else that we can say about the Stalin period in the Soviet Union, when he was writing this poem and when he was writing the subsequent works of the last decade of his life, Stalinist Soviet Union was very, very many things. But one of the things it wasn't was subtle, and it was not appreciative of any kind of ideological or aesthetic subtlety. And so while Kulbak was writing his confession for the deviations of the past, he was also, unfortunately, at the same time, implicating himself further in what was in the process of becoming aesthetic crimes. Back to 1922, back to Reisen, back to the subject at hand, the Byronic ballad. Why is this an important form for European poetry of the 19th century? Why is this an important form for Kulbak himself? Well, the ballad has a tremendously old history. I hope that you weren't tuning into this lecture series merely to learn that. But it has an interesting history in the Yiddish language in particular, and it is a literary history that Kulbak himself is among the first modern Yiddish writers to be aware of. If we were to go up on the street of Warsaw in 1895 and ask Yud Lamed Peretz, whom I spoke about last week, Reb Yitzchak, Pan Peretz, tell me about the history of Yiddish literature. If we were to go up to in Odessa to Shalom Aleichem or to Mendel Moicha Svarim, Reb Sholem, Reb Mendele, tell me about the history of Yiddish literature. None of them would be able to say anything about Yiddish literature prior to the 19th century. They would have talked about, oh, well, they write prayers for women in Yiddish. There's this old story called the Baba Maisa. That's in Yiddish, right? The women read commentaries on the Chumash, on the Pentateuch in Yiddish. But really, the Yiddish literature, it begins, I guess, in the 1820s when people start publishing these chapbooks, or it begins with these Hasidic stories that nobody can understand. Or these writers had a very short historical sense of how Yiddish had developed. By the beginning of the 20th century, that history begins to fill out in greater detail. People recover the original version of what had become the Baba Maisa as Das Bovebuch, which is an epic poem written in a tororima, in Renaissance Italian verse forms, in Yiddish, in the 16th century. People begin to establish literary antecedents for the literature that is being created in the 19th and the 20th century. And as I say, Kulbak was in the first generation of writers who were particularly conscious of this. There's a lot that's significant about that. And maybe we can comment on that at greater detail today, next time, the final session. But what I want to say now is that the ballad was a particularly important form for pre-modern Yiddish literature of the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries. And the ballad is a remarkable form because it combines artistic representation with a notion Not exactly our notion, not a modern notion, not a contemporary notion, but a notion that is important to understand on its own terms, of the actual, of the historical. The moment when we write a ballad is when we want to record something, something that really happened, a historical event, in verse form. That's profound. That's significant. That's worthy of our contemplation. Because at one and the same time, what the ballad is doing is it is recording a historical event in a memorable form, in a durable form, in a semi-permanent form, but it is also converting that historical event into the work, the material, the texture of legend. And where I want to go with this is the idea that the ballad equals event plus legend. And the legend comes out of this combination by virtue of the poetic effects that are used to render the event into verse. So this is the significance of the ballad in the early modern time. Byron, and like Byron, I'm going to put another name in, very important, I mentioned him last time, Heinrich Heine in German poetry, following on some of the very same leads, some of the very same impulses as Lord Byron, is the preeminent poet in German of the ironic ballad. And Heinrich Heine is a direct influence on our friend Yud Peretz and the other Yiddish poets of the late 19th, early 20th century that follow in Peretz's example. For these writers, for these early romantics, Heine and Lord Byron, the ballad is a perfect, what I would call, and I'm sounding like a grad student and I apologize, but you're all adults, so I think that you can handle it. It is the perfect ideological performance. And by ideological performance, I don't mean the kind of performance that the Politburo demanded of poets like Moshe Kulbak before they were sent off to the Gulag to die. I mean, it is the performance of an ideological position in which the author situates himself or herself in relation to history. And what the romantic ballad does is it calls attention to the obsolescence of its own form. We acknowledge, we regret is the ideological position of all romanticism, whether it's pictorial, whether it's poetic, whether it's, compositional, some great composer like Robert Schumann or Johannes Brahms. All romanticism is predicated on a notion of regret. There was a time when legends existed. There was a time when human beings supposedly had an uninterrupted relationship with modernity, with nature. There was a time when mystical, heroical, magical thinking was possible. We, as romantics, have been interrupted. We do not enjoy that unmediated relationship to nature, to magic, to revelation. We are situated in a circumstance of being constantly self-conscious of our own modernity. We know about history, we know about technology, we know about cities, we know about the world, we know about science, we know about all these facts. But we as romantics have a longing for something that we perceive now as out of our reach. It is something that has receded into a kind of primal memory, into the mists of mythology. We want to try to, as romantics, we want to try to re-enchant our life. And we sense in the performance of this gesture its own impossibility, which is to say, romanticism equals, and please don't write these equations down. I am not teaching an algebra class. I'm trying to offer a sense of how aesthetic form relates to a philosophical understanding of history. I'm not using these equations to be taken literally. These are figures. These are rhetorical tokens, if you will. But romanticism is romanticism is melancholy plus history. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean that the romantic, let's call it melancholy plus modernity, because it's a little bit more alliterative, and this is supposed to be a talk about poetry. Melancholy plus modernity. Now, what do I mean about that? The melancholy is a psychological condition for people who are in a state of interrupted and therefore interminable mourning. The classic definition of melancholy is to mourn something that was never yours to lose to begin with. I was born in 1788, if I'm Lord Byron. I was born in 1797, if I'm Heinrich Heine. I was born in an era where the modernity of my circumstance was something that I was already in a position to take for granted, at least in a philosophical sense. Melancholy is the regret at being born modern. And the object on which the melancholic subject fixates is by definition, because of the melancholy of the subject, something that's obsolete, something that exists but has lost its original purpose. So I want to get these two ideas in relationship with one another. Melancholy equals the subject as obsolescence equals the object. This is all kind of abstract, but I want this conceptual terminology to inform our reading of this ballad. First of all, to explain the attraction of the ballad to someone whom I'm consciously referring to as a neo-romantic, and to understand how Kulbak, in this transaction, in this equation, in this masterful and delicate and ultimately kind of heartbreaking ideological performance, exemplifies the philosophical, the historical, and the political conditions that inspire his writing. So let's think about form as a means of understanding the content of the poem itself, because that's ultimately what we do as literary critics. It's ultimately what we do as academics. It's ultimately what we do as attentive readers, particularly attentive readers of a literary form that is so demanding, that is so complicated, that is so rich with meaning and with implications as this kind of poetry is. Now, I can say a little bit more about the structure of the poem, and we'll get to that over the course of our session today and the following two sessions. But I want to talk in this respect about the formal logic of the poem. And the formal logic is to use the Byronic ballad, the ironic ballad, to dramatize the poet's relationship to his own autobiography. This is, Reisen is, an ironic autobiography. The way that the Diesner Child Herald that Kulbak will write 7 years later while living in Minsk, while functioning as a subject of the Soviet Union, it is an ironic relationship to his autobiography, the way that Diesner Child Herald is an ironic testament, confession of his time in Berlin. And note, if you will, the close proximity between the genres of autobiography and confession. We can return to that maybe later in our sessions. But I want to start today by very briefly reviewing the first small poem that we read last time. I want to read it again with you in English and then continue with the subsequent poems in Yiddish and in English. So here you will observe we are on the English website of Yiddishkeit Los Angeles, which has done just such an incredible and magnificent and marvelous job of making this poem available in a wonderfully idiomatic and at times really brilliant collective translation of the poem. I want to read this one again very quickly, and then we'll go more intensively and more carefully through the next poems. White Russia. Reisen. My grandpa in Kobilnik is a simple sort of fellow, a farmer with a horse and with an axe and with a sheepskin. As common as the clay are all my 16 uncles and my father. Hauling logs out of the forest, driving rafts upon the river, they toil the livelong day like ordinary peasants, then eat their supper of an evening gathered round a single platter, and fall into their 16 beds like sheaves of grain together. Grandpa, my grandpa, he can hardly climb the oven, half asleep at supper. His poor old eyes kept closing, and yet his feet have somehow found their own way to the oven. My grandpa's loyal feet, which served him for so many years. Just want to say very briefly something that I neglected or I was in too much of a hurry last time. One can never afford to be in a hurry when one is dealing with poetry. Note that this section begins in the present tense. Let us understand in a certain respect that there is a kind of permanent present tense in which this poem is declaimed. It is a poem about memory. It is about the transferal of memory from experience to legend. And in that sense, it occupies what we might call not just a psychological present tense, but also at one and the same time, a kind of legendary present tense. My grandpa is a simple sort of fellow. He always is, even though we know in the act of reading the ballad that the poem is referring not to an is, but to a was. We talked a little bit last time, very productively, very meaningfully, about some of the scriptural resonances of this, this first poem. But I want to reiterate not just what is scriptural, what is biblical about this poem, but what is not. That there is almost no reference in the poem as a whole to religious practice. There is almost no reference to religious ritual. There is almost no reference to traditional Jewish piety. This is almost unique in the Yiddish literature of Moshe Kulbak's generation. I'm going to stop share. We have, I think, yes. On line 9 of the first poem, the Yiddish word rufet afen oivim. So Fagel Libby has asked a question. So Fagel, I'm not sure if I understand the comment, but the reference to rufet, it is it's a Litvicism. It's a Litvish declination of the prefix verb. Ruf gehen, gehen rufet afen oiven. That's how that functions. I hope that that amplifies our understanding of the poem. I'm going to do screen share again. We're going to look now at the Yiddish version, but we're not going to read the first section again because we already did that last time. Here is the Yiddish version. I'm going to go up a little bit, make sure we're in the right spot. Oh, I've made so much progress. I'm being a bad reader. I'm going too quickly. Makosiet Hay. In Feld hat genommen Scheinziehen mit Näpplen von Ossien. Reus ist der Seide Tag zum Gemäusicht, das Hay Rabkossien. Ismen van Scharien auf Tag schein gewen begilfen. Azoi wie die Amese Klezmer, man hat sich zerstellt, salbe achset, der Seide berosch. Und weg is a Mizmer. A Sprei so ne Kerr mit die Plätzes a Switch, Punkt es tanzen in Sump a rumblitzen. Pa der Stickel a Bräut hat der Seide gesagt, muss man kinderlich schwitzen. Es haben sich blanker die Kosses zerpfeift, die Kapottes herab mit bewachsene Glieder, also wie die Hareke Jodles. A Tate an Alter mit 17 leibliche Brüder. Es sutten die Kosses, zerspritzt sich der Toi, und es fallen die Gräser auf Gräser nieder, a Fegele singt auf ein Nussbaum dabei. Als der Seide kann Poschet kein Ort nicht gefunden, wo sagst du dazu? Na dir gar a Kanareka Chasen inmitten der Rinnen. Da nennt man sich Tatschen, die Kosses, verreichert man, schabt man a Suppele Quass von einem Kriegel, danach steht man auf mit der Krechs. Pomme Hebach! Klung und es tut sich die Kosse a Spiegel. Beweis sich, verschwindt zwischen Groß, tut blank, 18 Kosses Geseder. Und sie begen sich sicher die Hand, oh, es knacken die Schenkeln. Und fest sitzt it wieder Geuder. Azoi bis der Eulem der seht wie der Reuter vernacht, leicht sich ab in die Kosses, tut Chevre a Schmeichel. Me seht schon dem Hering, dem Breiten, der Bobeschis Kes Saltenosses, der Landmann anem die Kapottes. Me geht und me hört zu die Wachteln verschreien, me geht mit die Kosses, verlegt auf die Plätzes, me guckt und me schweigt wie die Schleien. Okay, so let's share the translation now. Going on. Hay mowing. Over the fields the autumn mist had begun to stray. Grandpa left at dawn for the marsh to mow the hay. At the raking when day came, like jolly musicians dazed, 18 they stood, grandfather first, and sang a psalm of praise. A step, a twist of the shoulders, a whistle, as if swamp lightning leapt. For a piece of bread, children, my grandfather spoke, one has to sweat. And the skiffs whistled more brightly, coats off with hairy limbs like hairy furs. An old father with 17 blood brothers. The cysts twitch, dew spurts out, and the grasses fall one on the other. A bird sings in a nut tree nearby. Grandfather cannot be serene. What do you say to that? A canary, a canter, right on the scene. Now they sharpen their skiffs, smoke, grab a sip from the pitcher, then arise with a groan. Pama hey boy, boch. Hope I pronounced that right. A clang and the skiff is all glitter. Appears, disappears, and the grass blazes out. 18 skiffs in order. And the hands bend with sureness, the legs crack and sturdily rises each border, until all of them see the red twilight dim on their skiffs and decrease, and all of them smile. They can see the broad herring and the grandma's pancakes of cheese. They throw on their coats. They walk along listening to the quails shout. With their skiffs on their shoulders, they gaze and are mute as the trout. So I want to talk a little bit about what's happening in this section before we proceed. We've begun in a kind of primordial and legendary and permanent present tense. Now we return to memories, to the description of how this tribe of peasant Jews, likened to peasants, and the likening itself that we saw in the first section is significant because they are like peasants insofar as they are not like other Jews. There is no sense in Yiddish culture, in the Yiddish language, that a Jew can be an uninflected peasant. These refer not just to two sorts of occupations, but to two unmixable, unblendable cultures. And yet, these are Jews who are making their living like peasants. This is going to remain a significant motif over the course of our discussions and over the course of this poem. Over the fields, the autumn mist had begun to stray. Grandpa left at dark for the marsh to mow the hay. At the raking when day came, like jolly musicians' days. Now, just a little bit of word about the translation. This is a great translation, and I could not do better. However, I want to look a little bit at the original here for just a second. If we go back to the original, we notice that the word, in fact, that connects these so-called Jewish peasants to the klezmer musicians is the word begilifim, spelled like an ordinary Yiddish word here because we're dealing with a Soviet edition, but it's begilifim. It's originally a Hebrew-derived word, and it's one of relatively few Hebrew-derived words in the whole poem. And it doesn't just mean dazed, it means kind of tipsy, that there is something literally intoxicating about the soil, about the landscape, about the work that these peasant Jews perform. Let's go back to the translation. Like jolly musicians dazed, like jolly musicians intoxicated by the work that they are doing. 18 they stood, grandfather first, and sang a psalm of praise. Well, again, this is a good translation, and I'm not offering a correction. I'm merely offering a commentary that the original language does not say that they sang a psalm of praise. Their work is likened to a psalm of praise, via mizmer, which is both to say that that the work itself is a substitution for the prayer that traditional Jews are expected to recite at this time of day. The sun is rising. These Jews, they're not in the shtetl, they're not going to the study house, they're not going to the synagogue, they're not laying tefillin, they're not putting on prayer shawls. They're raking and hoeing and harvesting and planting. They are bound existentially with the soil. Not something we expect traditional Jews to do, but their work is like a song of praise. It's like a mizmer, which is to say it's done very efficiently and it's done very quickly. A traditional Jew in 19th century Yiddish literature and also in Hebrew literature recites psalms as if it were a muscle memory. Oh, is gich via mizmer. He is as fast as reciting a chapter of the Psalms. Do you know this subject? Do you know how to do this? Do you know how to fix a carburetor? Do you know how to rewire a transmission? Ich ken das via Yid in Ashre. I know that like a Jew knows how to recite the Psalm, Ashre Yosrei Besecha. It's that kind of what other Jews know as an uninterrupted relationship with the Jewish liturgy. I can do that via Mizmor, like a chapter of the Psalms. These Jews know harvesting. This is their psalm of praise. This is their prayer. This is their piety. This is their devotion. It is very, very unconventional and untraditional. And it is at least partly interrupted in Kulbak's actual biography by the fact that Kulbak, when he was growing up, was not harvesting hay, he was not planting flax, he was not doing these great agricultural works. He was studying in a Russian gymnasium, and he was studying at a very advanced Talmudic yeshiva. He's imagining an autobiography, or he's imagining part of his autobiography in this poem by strategically leaving out a lot of the other parts. A step, a twist of the shoulders, a whistle, as if swamp lightning leapt. I want to look at that in the original again, just a second. Not by way of correction, only by way of commentary. A Spreis und a Kerl mit die Plätze, das Switch, Punkt es tanzen in Sump herumblitzen. So they are moving the way that the lightning dances onto the swamp, and it is a meeting point of heaven and earth, of electricity and soil. It is a kind of cosmic moment of unity. We could even say in deliberately pretentious, in deliberately high-flown language, it is the congress of heaven with earth through electricity that is being conjured in this image. I'll go back to the English now. As if the lightning almost kisses the earth. For a piece of bread, children, my grandfather spoke, one has to sweat. This should certainly, deliberately, consciously evoke for us God's instruction to Adam. Once you eat that apple, once you eat that forbidden fruit, once you are exiled from paradise, it is by the sweat of your brow that you will earn your bread. This is the only reference. This is among the only references. This is virtually the only reference in the poem to traditional Jewish text. And it refers back to something, to the most primordial moment before there were Jews in the world, when there was only Adam, the father of Jew and non-Jew together, when it was only a primal humanity. We learn that it is for a piece of bread that we sweat each day. This is the legacy that the grandfather is laying claim to in this poem. One has to sweat. And the scythes, the skiffs, the scythes, the scythes. I've never said this word out loud before. It doesn't come up in everyday conversation for me. And it barely comes up in conversation in the Yiddish either. It's not an implement that we associate with 19th century Jews. But it is fundamental to these Jews, and that's why it's repeated, plitten, throughout the poem. They whistled more brightly, coats off, with hairy limbs like the hairy furs. The coats off, the kapotas. The kapota is the particular kind of coat that today we associate with Hasidic Jews, and in the 19th century was associated with any traditional Jew. It is a style of tailoring. It is a fashion statement that derives from Polish nobility in the 16th and 17th century. And only Jews maintain that style. Only traditional Jews, only the ultra-Orthodox, only the Hasidim today maintain that style of 16th century haute couture. Well, here in the fields, they take the kapotas off, because they're working Jews, not studying Jews, not idle Jews, not Jews who are living on breath and on wind. They're not Luftmenschen. They are Juden wie Päuer. They're Jews like peasants. An old father with 17 blood brothers. Well, not just blood brothers, but actual brothers. They're his brothers in toil, but they are his sons by genealogy. The skiffs twitch, dew spurts, the grasses fall one on the other, and a bird sings in a nut tree nearby. Grandfather cannot be serene. What do you say to that? A canary, a canter, right on the scene. A canary, a canter. This is the liturgy that these Jews encounter. Their experience is bound rhetorically by Jewish tradition, and yet their activities and their frame of reference is continuously non-Jewish, outside of the expectations of traditional Jews. The grandfather, we might well presume, knows all the Psalms by heart, like traditional Jews do, but he earns his living by working the soil. Now they sharpen their skiffs, smoke, grab a sip from the pitcher, a sip of kvass, by the way, which I presume for many of you is a beverage well known. For those of us not coming of age in Eastern Europe, kvass is a kind of cider. Not as sweet as like juice. It's usually made out of apple juice, or it can be made out of really any fruit juice, but it's very refreshing if you grew up in Eastern Europe. Then arise with a groan, Pomahé Boch. Can anybody provide me with a translation of Pomahé Boch? We'll talk about that in the discussion today. A clang and the skiff is all glitter, appears, disappears, and the grass blazes out. 18 skiffs in order. I want you to think about the image itself, this image of precise, coordinated, choreographed labor. It's not an image that occurs naturally. It's an image that can only occur in the imagination. And the hands bend with sureness, the legs crack. These are heroic peasants at the same time as they are Jews. I'm going to stop the share because we got some good. Kvass is made of fermented grain. Okay, Pomahé Bo, help us, God. Thank you, Anya. Thank you, Simon. Kvass is made of fermented grain. I happen to know that in Yiddish, there are references to kvass also being made from fermented fruit, but that's not to disagree. It's only to add to what has already been said, to what Simon is pointing out to us. It is thoroughly possible that these Jews are drinking the kvass from fermented grain. My association of it, which comes from Shalom Aleichem. Okay, so Anne Hannah is saying, we say skiff as saif, and kvass is from grain or fruit. So thank you all. Mikol Talmideni Hiskalti, from all of my students, I have gained wisdom. Kvass, fermented grain or fruit. A skiff is a saif. I'll get that right going on now. Pomahé Boch, Godspeed. That makes sense. Good. Going back now, maybe kvass is also ichthyolactic. Maybe so, Simon. That's a good point. I made the point that how we eat gefilte fish determines our Yiddish dialect, something that my professor David Roskis refers to as the ichthyolect, and it may very well be in northeastern Europe, in Lita, in Belarus, and in other places. Kvass was more frequently made of grain because that was more available, whereas in southern Eastern Europe, in Ukraine and in Galicia and in Romania, where fruit was more abundant, they made it from fruit. Very, 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 very possible. But I'm going to make the assumption with Simon that these Jews were drinking grain kvass, not fruit kvass. So to return now to our saifs, like I said, I mean, I've never mowed hay, and yet I pretend to understand this poem. It's kind of outrageous when you think about it. I'm going to stop the share, read the. In Ukraine, kvass is made of fermented grain. This is the most educational conversation about kvass I have ever conducted in my life. I am proud to be part of this discussion. And all of them smile. They can see the broad herring. Now we're going into very distinctly and explicitly Litvish Belarusian territory. Herring, I think all Eastern European Jews have an experience of herring, but Litvish Jews have a particular custom of eating herring. And specifically, herring served with cheese pancakes is a Thursday night feast among Lithuanian Jews. And the reason why it was is because you eat milchiks on Thursday, you're saving up your strength, your budget, your cooking repertoire to cook fleischiks on Friday. So herring has that. It is a workday fish, and it's very important. It's very, very frequent. This would be a very, very salty herring that I would imagine, and I would conjecture, might be served with the sweet farmer's cheese. You take them all in one bite. It's a flavor sensation unbeaten, at least north of Minsk. They throw on their coats, they walk along listening to the quails shout with their scythes on their shoulders. They gaze and are mute as the trout. Let's go on. Stopping the share. Herring was also baked in Litte. Yes, baked, fried, boiled, pickled. The Lithuanian Jews are the most creative herring producers and consumers in the Eastern European Jewish spectrum. I want to go back to the original for a second. The next poem is so really, really marvelous and great. And I want to make sure that we have time for discussion today. Kezlatkes, says Sima. That's easier for me to pronounce than the Belarusian equivalent. So we're going to keep referring to them as Kezlatkes. But we're going to go on with our reading of the poem because this is a great poem. So moving on. Gimel, chapter 3, die Babashi. Die Babashi gewesen is a Yidna Atznua, a Meister von a Kindlerke, a Kind zu jeden Frühling, und gring und gar und wehen, Punkt wie Hühner legen Eier, hat sie gelegt, die Zwillingen, a Zwilling noch a Zwilling. 3 Vetters hat die Babashi geboren auf den Beiden. 2 Vetters hat die Babashi verloren zwischen Eier. 11 Vetters hat die Babashi geboren auf den Euven. Mein Taten hat die Babashi geboren in a Shire. Und dann hat sich ihr Mutter Tracht auf ewig zugeschlossen. Die Babashi hat abgeschenkt für Arme die Windelig. Die Babashi, die Teire, hat abgetan das ihrige. Ist sie in Stube herumgegangen wie a Katschke zwischen Hinderlach. I'm going to go to the English now. My grandma. My grandma was a modest woman, a champion of childbearing, a child every spring, and easily, quite painlessly, like hens laying eggs, she laid sets of twins. Twins after twins she would bring. 3 uncles, grandma bore in the garret. 2 uncles, grandma mislaid in the coop. 11 uncles, grandma bore by the oven. My father, grandma bore in a barn. And then her womb was closed for good. Grandma most cherished had done what she needed to, as she walked about the house like a duck amidst her hatchlings. This is a great translation of a great poem. Some details that are left out. We'll return to the original. I want to see the comment. Love that word, kindlerke. Kindle, it's a neologism, indeed, to have children. Kindlerin, yes, she was a kindlerke. What was the grandmother's profession? She was somebody that had children. I'm going to go back to the original for a second. Keep in mind what the translation was, those of you who need to refer to it. Die Babysche gewesen is a Yidna Atznua. So the grandmother was a Jewish woman, a modest one, a pious one, a proper one. Gewesen, she was. The grandfather inhabits a legendary permanent present tense. The grandmother is already in the past tense. It is the pastness of the grandmother that signals the rupture between the poet, the speaker of the poem, who is not identical to the author of the poem, but a character that the author is inhabiting through the declamation of the poem, the rupture of the poet from his past. We're going to return to this theme as we continue to read the poem. She was a tsenua. She was a modest woman. She was a proper woman. She was a pious woman. She was a Meister von der Kindlerke. Nobody was better at having kids than my Baba. And if she had 18 kids, I'd say that that's quite a championship there. She had a child every spring, and easy, entirely without pain. Now, what, dear friends and comrades, what does this notion of having a child without pain, what does having a child without pain remind us of? And we're reminded that coop is going to be an important word in Kulbak's writing going forward. Let's keep that in mind. So Simon is reminding us that the Babysche has children without pain. This reminds us of Eve's curse. It is in pain that you shall deliver children, not the Babysche. There is something simultaneously pre-lapsarian, mythological matriarchy, as Sophia Korn points out to us. Mythological matriarchy meets a kind of animal fecundity. She is a demigoddess of fertility, and yet she's also like a chicken that lays an egg every spring. Going back to where we were. How does she have children without woe? The grandfather lives under Adam's curse. The grandfather must toil to earn his daily bread. The grandmother, who is pious and proper and modest and everything good, she lives without without Eve's curse. But Sophia asks, then her womb closed. Is that a curse? I can only say, after 18 kids, to me, that sounds like more of a blessing than a curse. I don't know. Ladies, help me out here. Am I right? But the point is, I don't know if we are supposed to interpret this as a curse. I don't read it that way. Because she had 18 children, she fulfilled her obligations as a Jewish woman, not just to her family, but also to the entire community. Hannah Gonchor agrees with me, so we know that I'm on the right track if Hannah agrees with me. Sie hat abgeschenkt vor Arme die Windelach. Die Babysche, die Teire, hat abgetan das ihrige. She fulfilled her obligations, not just to her family, but also to the poor people around her. When she was through with diapers, she gave them to the poor people around her who didn't have cloth for their own babies. She did everything right. Doesn't sound like a curse to me. Biblical twins were said to be warring in the womb, Fagel reminds us. We don't at all get that sense at the outset of the poem, that any of these 18 babies is growing up to be a child at odds with the rest of his brothers. Let's hold that thought, though, because there is a sense somehow that we are heading toward some kind of a rupture. Spoiler alert. And the rupture is connected intimately to the status of the grandmother in her primordial capacities. Now, the father is the last of the 18 brothers. And so he's the youngest. We would presume he would be, relatively speaking, one of the last to be having children, that the son, the speaker of the poem, who coincides with Moshe Kulbak only coincidentally, the son of the youngest of the fathers is going to have only a legendary memory of these people, right? If it's the 18th son, then by the time he starts having children, these would be primordial figures indeed. Let's try to make a little bit more progress before we open up the lecture to a more general give and take, and we give some other people a chance to speak. I'm going to go back to the Yiddish now. The Yiddish is about to get really difficult. Let's see if I can pull it off. I practiced all morning on this. We'll see how well I did. Okay. Metrei Plieten. Well, I know how to pronounce it in English now. Es haben die Näpplen verwischt und verschmiert alle Dörfer und Wegen. In Feld tat man an mit den warmen Ponnen die Kaltkeit von hängenden Regen. Es weisen sich Flecken von Bämer von Ehrgeiz Häuf. Ein Aswer von a Brunnen. Nur se schwimmt etwas an. Es wird weiß vor die Augen. Und als wird ein Neppel zerrunnen, a trockener Zweig fällt herab, es ist still. A Vogel hebt an it zu klagen, so kommt äußert in Leben a so viel a Riebe zu tragen, a so viel a Riebe zu tragen. Die zähnliche Quellchecklich pläsken zwischen die Beeten und murmeln und reden und zwischen die Näpplen weit, auf niemand, der hört sich die Stimme von dem Segen. Schmulja, hey, Schmulja, verpatscht ihm hinten auf Skarulia. Der Seide kriecht mit der Bord, mit der Nasser und tappt die Schwarzus, die Vetters in Neppel mit langen Busakes. Man spreißt auf die Plitten. Ort wären sie Nellem, man hört nur a Reus von der Weit, dem geschrienem Schmurs. Es tun a Pliesk, a Paschetnis, a Grob, und der Strom wird zerschnitten. Der Neppel füllt äußert die lehmige Bregen nicht da. Nicht kein Erd, nicht kein Wasser, und weich ist die Gegend so, und Mamosches, a warmer Atem a Blaser, nur es wickelt sich etwas, und gehen die Kohlele Tollen und Wälder herüber. Dort stehen verwickelt die Häuser, bedeckte wie Möbel, in gewirrische Stieber, und ort Platz do uffet a Chlorkeit, a Grine. So wird klarer bei sich in Neshama. Die Sonne tut a leicht, es beweist sich das Wasser und Verbes verwehnte und Lomme. Der Wald hat sich blue ausgewaschen, ist nass, und der Kopf seiner flackert. Es gießt sich a Hellkeit weit auf a Lonke. A Peurel steht dort und ackert. A Rachbes, a Frischkeit von grosige Lonkes, was schmecken und finkeln und weinen und schwimmen noch mit die Sticker von Näpplen. Geläumes von Felder und Plänen. Und sie schwimmen die Plitten gelassen. Parkerven rund mit die Bregen. Die streuen beidlich Strahlen und Paaren erreißet dem Treu und dem Regen. Dabei liegt der Seide, reichert die Lilke und schummert von Teinig die Augen. Die warme Erde hat sich glanzig und fett also stark ausgezogen. Zerkästelt in Felder Gemäusers, gelbe und helle und grüne, es gießt sich der durchsichtig zittrige Flachs. Auf bursteinige Stängelig diene. Die Grünkeit auf Felder Kartoffel liegt abgekielt, matt, ausgesotten und zerschmeichelt die rosige Chetschke mit sprenkelig weiße Beschotten. Es rinnen die Saften von der als ein Schickres nimmt durch alle Glieder. Es spart sich ein Leben, ein Stummer durch Gräser, durch Wurzeln und Zweigen. So halt mehr nicht äußert der Seide, tut sich ein Namen. Oh, kann mehr nicht schweigen. Der Land der Rewe, trast dir in deinen Taten. Und noch einmal wieder, trast dir in deinen Mamen. Als gappen sich ufe die Sinn auf die Plitten, man seht, als es fläzt herab von die Felder, die Farben, die heiße wie Stromen. Es sprudelt von Frühling rein in der Welt, und allein ist man euch da inmitten. Es tut sich da, was auf die Felder, was hat nicht kein Namen. Azoi hat der Seide die Plitten getrieben, kein Preisen. Ist vernachtlich rein mit der bläuer Wille, in niemand, in Weißen. Hat man die Schräges vergraben in Samt und die schwere Schwarzures verbunden. Und Feiern haben die Vetters auf jet wieder Plit angezündet. Schweigewdig Mied, Salbe zweit bei a Feier, azoi is men Gräue gesessen, gebrochen das rosige Bräut und den Borscht von dem Teppel gegessen. Es ist still auf der Gegend gewesen, es haben nur Bläue die Wellen gesungen. Es hat noch a Feier sich hilkig zerblättert, zerlegt wie a reutinker Blimmel. Und es ist nur a Fisch, wenn nicht wenn, von dem Wasser dem Kielen gesprungen. Bläu ist gewesen und a reute Levane, a schwere Reus ist von Himmel. Let's go back to the English now. Driving the rafts. The mists have erased and smudged every road, every town. In the field, your warm face meets the cold of rain coming down. Blotches of tree, of some yard, the pulley on a well touch your gaze, but something swims up. Your eye faces white, in the mist all is haze. A withered branch falls, it is quiet. A bird sings in despair. In this life, there is so much to endure, so much to bear. Tins of rivulets splashing in their beds chattered and murmured. Through the far, far mists on the Niemen, grandfather's voice is heard. Shmulia, hey Shmulia, get your rear into Skarulia. Grandpa, wet-bearded, crawls about the fingers and fingers the barges. In the mist, the uncles with long hooks step over the rafts. Now they vanish. Off on one side, their shouted talk emerges. The sinkers splash a hole, the river is slashed. The mist fills up the clay banks. There is no water, there is no land, and the region is so soft, its texture, a breath, warm and bland. But something is unfolding. The manifold valleys and forests loom. Their houses stand shrouded in bareness, furniture in a rich man's room. Here, green lucidity bursts open. Even one's soul grows clear. The sun shines forth, water and lame weeping willows appear. The forest has taken a bath, is wet, and his hand is aflare, and brightness walks far off in a meadow. A peasant plows there. A lushness, a freshness of green meadows that smell, shimmer, complain, and scraps of mist still swim about the dreams of field and plain. Slowly, slowly the rafts float, swing round with the shores of the stream. The straw huts radiate their moisture and rain into steam. There rests Grandpa smoking his pipe and squinting his eyes in delight. The warm earth has hastily stretched itself out, all plump, all bright, checkered by fields, by marshes, yellow and lucent and green. The transparent, trembling flax tumbles over on its stalks, amber and thin. The green on field potatoes lies opaque, limp, exhausted. And the short pink buckwheat smiles with white speckles frosted. The earth saps are rising. In the body, drunkenness reigns. A voiceless life thrusts through grass, through root, and through tendril. Grandpa can no longer bear it. Oh, he cannot keep still. He bellows, "May your father have the tremors." And once more again, "May your mothers have the tremors." The sons on their barges jump up. They see from the fields are flowing in streams hot colors of flame. The world is sprouting with spring, and they too are right at its hub. Lord of the universe, on these fields, something is happening that has no name. Skarulia is a kind of mooring. Any Belarusian speakers know this word? I'm curious as well. So something again is rendered very precisely, but within this language, something resonates that is very wondrous, very legendary, very magical. At the same time, we're describing the harvest, we're describing taking the produce on barges down the river to sell somewhere in Prussia. Remember, this is long before World War I that this poem is being recited, is being recalled, is taking place. There's a lot to discuss in each image, but we don't have time for each image now because I want to open this up to more general discussion. Just want to focus on one image in particular, and it's something that I want to discuss in the original, please. If I can find it. So if we look at this line, es rinnen die Saften von Dreher, als a Schickres nimmt durch alle Glieder. Es spart sich a Leben Stummer durch Gräser, durch Wurzeln und Zweigen. Os halt man nicht äußert der Seide, tut sich a Naam. Oh, kann mehr nicht schweigen. Langt a Rewe, Trasie in dein Taten. Und noch einmal wieder Trasie in dein Mamen. I want to talk about this image here. Es spart sich, es rinnen die Saften von Dreher, als a Schickres nimmt durch alle Glieder. There flows, there drips, there runs juices in the earth, such that a drunkenness seeps through every limb. What's magical, what's overripe, what's legendary, what's almost ominous in this language, and it's an image that recurs almost identically in the first work of prose that Kulbak writes at about the same time, Mashiach ben Ephraim, which we talked about a little bit last week. This notion of becoming one with the earth is simultaneously a transfiguration and a living death. And I want us to think about this as we go on with the poem next week and in the following week. How is this simultaneously legendary, magical, and at the same time an elegy, funereal? Because this position of a magic that has been disenchanted, this position of a legendary world that is seen but not apprehended, this is the posture of melancholy. This is the position out of which every Byronic ballad is sung. So we have a few more minutes left. I have lots of minutes left. I'm gonna throw things open. I'm gonna stop the share. I'm gonna ask people now for discussion, for questions, for comments, for corrections. If it's possible, maybe people can unmute themselves and speak directly, but let's try to speak for at least another 15 minutes. And if we want to go on a little bit longer, it's really at Simon's discretion how much longer we will continue. I'm going to read some of the comments because I haven't read them yet, and maybe some other people haven't seen them. Skarulia is a kind of mooring. It's actually a village now part of Jonava, Lithuania, where the Vilja makes a sharp turn. This is important. I want to think about, and this is not the only place where we are going to receive a reference to a place name in the poem. The place names are not necessarily significant for Jewish history in Belarus. They are significant to the legendary and historical memory of Belarus as a whole. These places are villages in the 19th and 20th century. These were important settlements in Belarus in the 14th and 15th century. These place names are one of the clues as to how Kulbak is imagining an epic poem for Belarus sung in Yiddish. Other thoughts, other comments, other questions? There seems to be a parallel of Kulbak's peasant Jews in their relation to nature and the Zionist ideal of the new Jew working the land. What was Kulbak's attitude to Zionism? This is really, really important. Kulbak's attitude to Zionism, I would say negative. Well, negative in practice. I am not 100% certain how negative it was in theory for these reasons. First of all, there were many Yiddishists, including Yiddish poets, Yiddish writers, in the circles that Kulbak frequented, who would describe themselves as linke Politien, which is to say the furthest left wing of left-wing Zionism. And if we understand the ideology of Politien, if we understand the ideology of a workers' Zionism, this is actually the ideological strand of Zionism that David Ben-Gurion derives from. But the ideological politics of linke Politien, of the left wing of the Zionist movement, was that Hebrew should be a language for the settlements in Palestine, and Yiddish should be the language of the Jewish working classes in the diaspora. There were Zionists that were very positively inclined toward Yiddish. And it is possible that certainly many of the people that Kulbak associated with adhered to this ideology. It is possible that at some point in Kulbak's career, he also did. He was struggling with Hebraist in Vilna in school matters. This does not necessarily mean that he was anti-Zionist as an ideological posture, because anybody who's ever been to Israel knows all Zionists constantly struggle with all other Zionists simultaneously and interminably. And that wing of Zionism was actually, as Hannah Ganshor is reminding us, loosely affiliated with the central Yiddish planning committees of Polish Yiddishism at the time. Here's where I want to go with this. Ideologically, I cannot offer a definitive statement about Moshe Kulbak's ideological anti-Zionism. In practical matters, Kulbak was a Yiddishist. He lived in Vilna after he returned to Eastern Europe from Berlin. Then he migrated to Minsk, where he was making a conscious affiliation, not in ideological membership, but in existential fact, with the Soviet Union. So it is possible indeed that there is a militancy to his non-Zionism that grows as he goes to the Soviet Union. This might be just out of convenience, out of ideological necessity, or it might be of actual conviction. I will not say that Kulbak moved to Minsk only for ideological reasons. And the evidence I have of this, according to his friends in Vilna, he packed his tallis and tefillin with him when he moved to Minsk. So take that ambivalent gesture for what it is worth. Sophia asks, where was this poem written, in the USSR or in Berlin? It was written in Berlin. It was written in 1922. It is one of the most remarkable achievements of his Berlin career, which lasted for about 3 years. Now, Simon is asking, is there possibly a neo-Hasidic overtone to Kulbak's sacralization of nature? I think it's possible. And I think it is possible partly through the influence of Peretz on Kulbak, because Peretz was very keen on repurposing the rhetoric of Hasidic stories for a secular modern function, a secular Hasidism. Please join me in enjoying the contradiction of terms that bespeaks. Yiddish literature, let me tell you a pro tip. Yiddish literature is never secular, but it is always secularizing. And it is making modern use of traditional, which is to say religious imagery and rhetoric. So it is very possible that a kind of neo-Hasidism is motivating this attitude toward nature. It is also possible, and not necessarily a contradiction, to point to parallels between Kulbak's valorization of the Jew in nature and a parallel contemporaneous valorization of nature in Zionist rhetoric. Where all this is coming from, and what I do know about Kulbak and his ideological location in this poem, which, to reiterate, because this is so fundamental to everything that I'm talking about, was written in Berlin, not in Belarus. Joan Goldstein asks a really, really pertinent question. I'm going to get to that in a second. Not ignoring the question, Joan. But where this notion of valorizing the Jew in the land is coming from is an ideological movement that is known in Yiddish at the time, and it is fundamental, as Landkenntnis. Discover the land, acquaint yourself with the land, know thy land. That's the ideology that unites all of the modern Jewish political movements of Polish Jewry, broadly defined in the early 20th century. Landkenntnis. Landkenntnis is fundamental to Polish language and Polish culture assimilationism, which we cannot underestimate in its significance for Polish Jewry, especially after World War I, when Kulbak is writing. Landkenntnis, know thy land, is fundamental to the ideology of the Bund, which preaches Doakite. The Jewish homeland is where the Jew is at. And Landkenntnis, know thy land, is fundamental to Polish Jewish Zionism, because we have to know how to live in and on and from the land in Poland before we can make Aliyah and settle our actual land, the land of Israel. So one of the phenomena of interwar Polish Jewry was kibbutzim in Poland that are like kibbutzim with training wheels, training the Zionists how to live on, from, in, with the land before they make Aliyah, which some of them were lucky enough to have done. Landkentisch, and by the way, when I say Polish, keep in mind Vilna was part of Poland. Much of what becomes Soviet Union, what becomes Soviet Belarus, was technically in Poland right after World War I. So to return to Joan's remark, Yud Schwartz wrote an epic poem called Kentucky. Are there any connections between these two epic poems? If I'm not mistaken, Schwartz's Kentucky was published in 1925, which is a couple of years after Reisen was published. But here's what's fundamental about this connection. Reisen, Kulbak's poem, was published in the United States. Contemplate with me for a second the triangular geography: Belarus, Berlin, the United States, in what is the publication geography of Yiddish poetry between the two wars. Schwartz would not have been an influence on Kulbak writing Reisen, but it is eminently possible. It's a likelihood that Schwartz would have read Reisen while writing Kentucky. So AG is reminding us that there is, Anton is saying that there is a beautiful painting, portrait, image of the life of the folk in this poem, and that's ultimately true, and that's the final point that I want to make for my remarks today, and we're going to pick up here next time. Landkenntnis, know thy land, fundamental to the Bundes, fundamental to the Zionists, fundamental even to the Polish assimilationists. But here's the trick, and here's what makes this poem so quintessentially and definitively an epic of Jewish Belarus. There were no group of Yiddish writers who better rendered their relationship to nature than what we would call the Jewish Litvaks, what we would call the Belarusian and Lithuanian and Northeast Polish and even Estonian Jews of Eastern Europe. Not me, because what do I know? Am I right? Itzik Manger, the great poet from Czernowitz, from Bukovina, from way down in the south, the southernmost of the great Yiddish poets, Itzik Manger, once wrote a short essay called Drei Litvakis. And he talks about Mendel Moiches Forum, the literary presence of Sholem Yankov Abramovich. He talks about Moshe Kulbak, and he talks about Avram Sutzkever, another great poet of what we would call Jewish Lithuania, broadly defined, the peppery gefilte fish tribe of Eastern European Jews. What distinguishes all three of these writers, according to Manger, is the utter precision and gift for evocation of nature that these three writers possess, unparalleled by any other Yiddish writers in modern Yiddish literary history. And Manger's hypothesis, and I think that there's a lot to this. I really love this essay and I really love this interpretation. He says, isn't it remarkable that the Jews who live in the most hostile terrain of the Eastern European territory where Jews settled have the fondest, the most intimate, the most evocative relationship to nature itself in their own writing? This is Kulbak's supreme achievement. It is his sublime achievement. Sima is asking, where can one find Manger's essay? It is in his volume Schriften in Prosa, his prose writings, not his fictional writings, not his poetry writings, but his collected essay, Schriften in Prosa. I'll write it down here. Schriften in Prosa, which can be downloaded from the Yiddish Book Center online. Thank you for today. I enjoyed this. I hope everybody else did. I'm appreciative of your presence. I'm appreciative of your engagement. I'm appreciative of your corrections, especially in pronouncing the word scythe. Couldn't do any of this without you. I hope we will all convene again in good weather and in good health a week from today. We'll see you next time. Thank you all.
Very much, Mark. See you, everybody, in a week at the same time. We will send you the reminder. And again, everything is recorded and can be reviewed and reread. And we finish now. Thank you. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.